mission or in a tough dogfight, the Super Sabre is ready for anything. A test pilot must be ready for anything, too. That's why I do everything I can to stay in top condition. I always get plenty of rest and start off each day by eating a good breakfast with a cereal like Rice Chex or Wheat Chex. They're packed full of energy and they taste swell. Why don't you try them?
Keep yourself ready for some real action, like Bob Baker and Phil Houghton and lots of other famous test pilots when they spark up with Chex.
Rice Chex, Wheat Chex.
The North American F-86 Sabre is one of the most legendary planes the United States has ever built. It was a revolutionary plane in every aspect of its design and performance. The F-86 was an elite fighter jet in its time. It entered service in 1949, and it went toe-to-toe with the Soviet MiG-15 in the skies over Korea, and its performance would remain legendary. It was the first swept-wing production jet fighter the United States ever produced. But North American aviation did not stop development on this swept-wing platform after the F-86 was produced. They continued evolving its design. What they came up with was the F-100 Super Sabre. North American aviation delivered an unsolicited proposal for a supersonic day fighter to the U.S. Air Force that they dubbed Sabre 45, due to the fact that the wings had a 45-degree sweep. It was clearly a more developed and evolved F-86 Sabre. North American aviation delivered a mock-up of the plane for inspection by the U.S. Air Force on July 7, 1951. The U.S. Air Force was intrigued, but not very impressed with the prototype mock-up. They submitted a list of modifications that they wanted, and it was a long list. Over 100 modifications were required before the U.S. Air Force accepted the aircraft. It was dubbed the F-100 by the U.S. Air Force on November 30, 1951. In January of 1952, the Air Force ordered 2 prototypes for testing. Designated the YF-100, it first flew on May 25, 1953, 7 months ahead of schedule. The plane would have a max speed of 924 miles per hour, a range of 1,995 miles, a service ceiling of 50,000 feet, and was powered by a single Pratt & Whitney J57 afterburning engine that produced 10,200 pounds-foot of thrust normally and 16,000 pounds-foot with afterburner. Its primary armament was 4 20mm M39 cannons, each with 200 rounds of ammunition. Its wings had 6 hardpoints with a capacity to carry up to 7,000 pounds in various combinations of missiles, rocket pods, external cannons, conventional bombs, or even a Mark 43 nuclear weapon. The plane broke the sound barrier as a prototype, reaching Mach 1.05. The first non-experimental plane to perform this feat. The F-100 will become the first operational aircraft in the Air Force to be capable of breaking the sound barrier in level flight. Then in October of 1953, the YF-100 prototype set a new airspeed record of 755 miles per hour at low altitude. The first production aircraft flew in October of 1953, and the Super Sabre entered service on September 7, 1954. Much in the way that North American had continued evolving the F-86 and it morphed into the F-100, they also never ended their development of the Super Sabre. The results of this would become what we know today as the F-107, which never entered production. The U.S. Air Force was pleased with its performance, even though the plane suffered from many handling issues, one of which was poor directional stability, and at low speeds could lead to a sudden and unrecoverable yaw and roll. This issue eventually led to the death of North American's chief test pilot George Welsh in October of 1954. It became known to pilots as the Sabre Dance, and it was deadly. The swept wings of the plane had a tendency to lose lift in certain circumstances and pitch the nose of the plane upwards. This would cause compressor stall in the engine, dooming the aircraft to a violent crash. Even as this issue was still being corrected, North American decided to push the jet into production. This would prove to be a deadly decision. Although the plane had great performance for its time period, it was also dangerous. 1958 would be the deadliest year for the Super Sabre. 116 F-100s would be lost in accidents that would kill 47 pilots. It's important to keep this in perspective. Those horrible types of accidents were also happening to many other aircraft in this time period. The technological boundaries of jet aircraft were being pushed to the bleeding edge during this stage of the Cold War. There is a reason test pilots were so respected and idolized in the 1950s. Their survival rate wasn't pretty. Great innovation comes with great dangers. The Hun was the perfect example of this philosophy. On May 13, 1957, 3 F-100s set a new world distance record for a single-engine aircraft. They flew the 6,710 miles from London to Los Angeles in 14 hours and 4 minutes. Then in August of 1959, the jet became the first fighter plane to fly over the North Pole. The aircraft still had some major issues that needed to be ironed out. It still suffered from low speed stability issues, and in the first 2 months of its operation, it suffered 6 major accidents. The entire inventory of F-100s were grounded until February of 1955, even after more work and research was performed on the plane. The problems persisted until the A model was finally phased out completely in 1958. Later models of the F-100 were equipped with yaw and pitch dampeners to correct the Sabre Dance issues. They were also largely converted over to a fighter-bomber role, which used an improved J-57 engine, air-to-air refueling, and various hardpoints placed along the wings. North American aviation never ceased in its endless pursuit of perfecting the F-100, which by the time was known by most pilots and crews as the Hun, or short for 100. The F-100 was also being tested and equipped to employ zero-link launch capabilities, also known as a ZEL launch. This was a method where the jet fighters would be strapped with a solid-fueled rocket booster and launched into the air from a mobile platform just like a rocket. This allowed the planes to take off even if a runway had been destroyed. Testing proved that the F-100 was capable of a ZEL, even while carrying both external fuel tank and a single nuclear weapon mounted to each of its hardpoints under the wings. During tests, it was shown that a ZEL launch produced a 4G strain on the pilot, which was very safe. The plane would be accelerated to around 300 miles per hour before the detachable rocket booster would fall off, allowing the plane to fly normally. In January of 1956, the D model was rolled out, which had many corrections for the previous issues. The focus of the aircraft was also shifted to a different role with the debut of the D model. It moved from being primarily a fighter and into more of a ground attack aircraft that also possessed some fighter capabilities. The D models were fitted with autopilot, improved avionics, and also the capability to fire Sidewinder missiles. 65 F-100s were also modified to deploy the AGM-12 Bullpup air-to-ground missile. Wingspan was also extended by 26 inches and the vertical tail surface area was increased by almost 30%. Even the D models had their issues with reliability. In fact, the constant speed drive, which was the transmission box that was used to turn an electrical generator that provided power to the aircraft, was so unreliable that the Air Force required a secondary oiling system to be installed just for the transmission. By 1965, the various aircraft had been modified so many times by so many different contractors and crews that the Air Force decided to completely overhaul over 700 F-100s to standardize these modifications across the board. This made weapons capabilities consistent and maintenance much easier to perform. This program cost $150 million to perform and took around 60 days per plane to install. The F-100's service in Vietnam began in 1961. 6 Super Sabres were deployed from Clark Air Base in the Philippines to Thailand for air defense purposes. It would end up being the longest serving jet fighter bomber to serve in Vietnam. Its role in Vietnam was varied, serving as escorts for F-105s, running wild Weasel missions to distract surface-to-air missiles away from bomber groups, and eventually being restricted to close air support and ground attack roles. The F-100 logged 360,283 combat sorties in Vietnam. More combat sorties were flown by the 4 air wings of F-100s in Vietnam than by all the 15,000 P-51 Mustangs that served during World War II combined. Beginning in 1966, the planes were restricted from flying over North Vietnam and were relegated to mainly a ground support aircraft used to provide close-in ground support. The Super Sabre was also the pioneer of the Wild Weasel missile defense system, where the planes were fitted with special equipment that could detect ground-based radar. They would fly below bomber groups and bait surface-to-air missile systems into targeting them. Once their radar beams were detected, they could be traced to their source and the SAM site could be destroyed by the plane. The F-100 didn't have good enough performance to survive in this role for very long though. After 45 days of operations against North Vietnamese targets, there was only one airplane left, and out of the 16 original crew, 4 had been killed, 2 were now POWs, 3 had been wounded, and 2 had outright quit. The duty was eventually passed to F-105s and then on to F-4 Phantoms. No F-100 was recorded as being shot down by an enemy aircraft during the war, but 242 F-100s were lost in the war. 186 were shot down by anti-aircraft fire, 45 crashed from operational issues, and 7 were destroyed by attacks on air bases. In 1967, the Air Force began a project to strengthen the airframe of the plane to extend its service life from the original 3,000 flying hours up to 7,000. This was done due to the high loss rates in Vietnam. Up to 50 F-100s were being lost per year, mainly due to issues with the plane, not actual combat-related losses. Over its service life from 1954 until 1972, the U.S. Air Force lost a total of 889 F-100s to accidents. 324 pilots passed away in these accidents. That is insane. Most of the remaining F-100s were turned over to the Air National Guard. The plane was operated by them until 1979 when it was finally phased out in favor of the F-4 Phantom and then finally the F-16. After the Air National Guard retired the plane from service, many of them were converted into remote-controlled drones to be used as targets for testing new weapons or pilot training missions. 2,294 F-100s were built between 1953 and 1959. Planes served in dozens of foreign countries' air forces through the years, the last ones being retired by China in 1988. There is still a lot of surviving aircraft out there, tons of them in museums, on display as monuments, and many are still being flown by private collectors. Alright, so that's my F-100 video, guys. The Super Sabre is pretty awesome. Definitely like the video if you liked it. Definitely share it if you can. Definitely comment. And one thing I want to say is, all the guys that have been commenting on my videos and like sharing your stories about your parents, different stories about your experiences with the aircraft or whatever subject you're commenting on, I really appreciate that. It's, for one, it helps my videos get shared more, and number two, it's like a preservation of your story for everybody to read. So that comment's going to be there for as long as YouTube is around. And I'm obviously never going to delete my channel. I'm just going to leave it up, even if I like die or something. God forbid. But I really appreciate that. I really enjoy reading them. I do read the comments. I comment on them as I can. I'm extremely busy, so it's really hard for me to sit down and comment on on all of you guys' stories and stuff. But I try my best. I really appreciate that. Keep it up. Share your history. Share your stories. Put it out there, because we have to preserve that history for everybody else that comes after us that can read it and understand what it was like to live back then during the Cold War. Alright guys, well, thanks for supporting my channel. Got a lot of awesome subscribers and everything being added to the channel. It's growing really quick. Thank you. Bye.